also kind of a national event with 300 people attending. Most of them, aren't traveling that far from Seneca Falls, New York. But it's important that we see that there are 300 people here. For the first day, only women are allowed to attend, and the second day, men are also allowed to attend. Frederick Douglass, who is an ardent feminist, is one of the gentlemen listed as attending this meeting. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's opening speech at Seneca Falls says, "We're assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love." So the Seneca Falls group come up with 11 different resolutions, all pointing to discrimination against women and really the subjugation and subordination of women. As you know, women are regarded as dependents without voice legally, similar to children. The declaration will describe women's grievances and demands, pulling language straight from the revolution. For example, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," the document says. It also lists what are they consider to be abuses of women, the way in which men have total power over what a woman does, can do, has access to, that women are totally dependent upon men, if not their husbands, then their fathers and their brothers or uncles. So the right to vote is the right to empower women to be out from under the thumb of oppressive men. In the final resolution, one of the final resolutions, the ninth one, which is the most controversial, it calls for women, quote, "to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise or the right to vote." One of the things that's especially important about Seneca Falls for Black women is that this convention says nothing about abolition or slavery. It is solely for women's rights for suffrage. What we see Black women doing, so if we think of Seneca Falls as a kind of turning point where 300 people are coming together and have a resolution that says women should have the right to vote, excluding abolition, what Black women are doing is continuing this intersectional struggle. Black women like Sojourner Truth, who very often we think of solely in terms of her speech, Ain't I a Woman, which, by the way, is a paraphrasing of what she actually said. But she was, in fact, one of the major speakers on the abolitionist circuit, just like Frederick Douglass. William Lloyd Garrison publishes her biography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave. Sojourner Truth is also an itinerant preacher. So when she speaks, she is very often making biblical references. She will often reference the story of Esther as a powerful woman who saves her people. She will also help recruit troops during the Black troops during the Civil War. And she also argues for giving land to free Black people after the war, saying that what Black people want is economic independence. And the only way for them to have that independence is to work their own land. By the time we reach emancipation, which we talked about last week, Black people are seeing the end of enslavement. And what we can now have for the first time is Black women can organize nationally. We should think of it similar to what I may have mentioned last week. One of the important pieces of the evolution of the Black church is that at the time emancipation comes, the Black church is, 3 generations old. And so an established national institution can move south with emancipation and create this center of political organization that is already established. It doesn't have to create this platform. So this political platform moves south. And one of the things that Black women are from the North are also already practiced in is using the Black church as a place where they also can work toward carving out their own place for their own agenda. Freedom for Black people isn't, as we know, an easy shift. In spite of the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment, I want you to see the South Carolina example of what freedom really means right at the beginning of, at the end of the war. And essentially what Southern states do, the former Confederacy, is to try and re-enslave Black people by creating labor contracts where they have to work for their same master, restrictions on their movement, punishments, just like they had when they were enslaved, the ability to pick up Black people, especially Black men, but women as well, who are not working for their former master, and to label them as vagrants, and then to imprison them where white property owners can come and purchase Black men and women who are imprisoned for vagrancy to work for them. Courts, trials, punishments are all decided by race. And then finally, you also have the continuation of the violence that we talked about from the colonial period. So I want you to see the end of slavery as being a period of very harsh transition, not a period of jubilee. The Ku Klux Klan, and as you see depicted here in this political illustration, the White League is organized by former Confederates to especially keep Black men from voting. And what I have for you here with all the misspellings are the, so you can see what's in these placards in this drawing. One says, White League, attention, you're ordered to meet for drill. And what that means is white men are being gathered together to patrol, just like they did during the period of enslavement, to pick up Black people, to harass Black people. And so you have this kind of militia police force being formed. Notice, no blank votes allowed here by order of the White League. An effort to suppress the Black male vote. And then the other sign says, the immaculate white man's polls. The 14th Amendment then comes into place, is put into place by Congress to try and address this effort to re-enslave and suppress Black people. The 14th Amendment defines citizenship. Who is a citizen? It will guarantee due process and equal protection. It will therefore nullify that 3/5 clause that says Black people are only counted as 3/5, and it will say all citizens are fully counted. It's issue that we've heard most recently in terms of the 2020 census. The Constitution says all citizens are counted, all people are counted for representation. And it also calls for reducing state representation by whatever numbers Black people, Black men in particular, are denied voting rights. So if you deny a percentage of the population voting rights, you lose that percentage of representation in Congress. And then finally, it's only the 15th Amendment that constitutionally guarantees Black men the right to vote. I see something in chat. I'm going to pause here to see if there's a question. There's a question about the slides. No, I actually don't at this point share the actual slide presentation, but I can provide for you, as I had said in the other two lectures, I will be putting up on my website. And also I can send it to the adult school to send out to the mailing list. I will be providing a bibliography so that you will have access to a lot of the materials and articles about these topics. One of the most important things for Black women was that is often ignored is the violence against Black women's bodies. Typically, when people construct the image of lynching and violence in their heads, it is always Black men. But Black women and children were also killed and lynched. And Black women become the victims of wanton, rape that is committed by white men and with impunity. And so we'll see couple of examples of that throughout this lecture, but I wanted to bring to your attention this particular one from 1863 military court, where Harriet Elizabeth McKinley testifies against a Union soldier and says, he dragged me past a post, I caught hold of it, and then it describes how he flung his knee on her back, how he wrestled her to the ground and held her down. The court, the judge asks, essentially, did he penetrate you as well? And she says, yes, he did. We have also the case in Darlington, South Carolina, 1865, just before the war ends. Amy Spain is lynched, and she is lynched for treason, for giving information to Union forces, and also really for being insubordinate. She is hanged. What you see on the left is part of the Equal Justice Initiative, which is a website I will reference for you in the bibliography, is a memorial to 500 people lynched just during Reconstruction. And these lynchings are not only individual people, but also mass lynchings, where you have, as you can see in this particular slide, Mobile County, Alabama in 1865, 138 Black people lynched. So we are talking about mass murders occurring during this early part of Reconstruction. Another example from Savannah, Georgia, fall 1868, a riot with 3 Black people killed, specifically on Election Day. This becomes very common, where Black people die trying to vote. In this particular example, Octavius Valentine Cato is assassinated October 10th, 1871 in Philadelphia, also when he is trying to exercise the vote. 1873, Colfax, Louisiana, is a full massacre and riot when Black people show up en masse to vote and are shot and killed, as you see in the illustration on the left. So the effort to vote for Black people, even though it is guaranteed in the Constitution, is a literal battle. Thousands of Black people give their lives trying to vote, to exercise citizenship. And this is after having, as you know, 5,000 Black soldiers serving in the Revolutionary War, Black soldiers serving in the Civil War, and already having shed blood for the country. But that doesn't shift at all the exclusion of Black people from the electorate. With federal protection, federal troops sent to the South by Congress to protect and oversee the freedom of Black people, we do have Black men voting and being elected. As you see in the slide on the left, I want to emphasize these numbers. The Black office holders are in local, state, and federal positions. They are on local school boards. They are rewriting the new state constitutions that have to be ratified in order for these former Confederate states to actually rejoin the Union, and then also send representatives to Congress. They are in federal offices as well. They're serving as lieutenant governors. And one of the most important things that Black men do, men and women do, in changing Southern government is creating public schools and the funding of public schools. That occurs because Black people are serving on the constitutional conventions to rewrite the Constitution and want public education for their children. Just as an example of how this kind of rolls out through time, so we can see the significance of what happens under congressional Reconstruction, and also see the enormous gap between what happens during congressional Reconstruction and in some ways doesn't happen again for a century or more later. There are 2 Black senators in the US Senate in the 1870s, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi. There won't be another Black senator until Senator Edward Brooks in 67. Again, 100 years, almost 100 years later. And then the first woman senator will be Carol Moseley Braun from Illinois in 1993. So what you see here is this century of suppression of Black votes and a century of the suppression of Black political participation and leadership. In the House of Representatives, what some historians call the first generation of 1870 to 1887, that would be that congressional Reconstruction period. There are 15 Black people in the House of Representatives. Second generation, the end of Reconstruction, there will be 5 Black men in the House of Representatives. And again, almost a century later, we begin to get this third generation. And I'll talk about, to some extent, how and why we get this third generation, 1929 to 1970. Why do we see these numbers go back up? And then, of course, Shirley Chisholm becomes, in 1969, the first Black woman to serve in the House. Let me check the chat and see if there's some questions. Okay, Doris is talking about having met Congresswoman Braun. That's absolutely wonderful. And I am so sorry some of you missed last week, but I can ask the adult school to do a reprise if necessary. I know that we will be talking about additional lectures. And so one of the things, I didn't get Maurice's permission to do this, but if you want to put into the chat some things you might want me to present on and have a class. And the winner, just put it into the chat, and then we'll have a record of some of the things you're interested in. So what we've seen, right, is the suppression of the Black male vote and the protection of the vote from the federal government for Black men. So the question becomes, of course, what are Black women doing? They haven't been given the right to vote. And we also know, let me give you just, I think, the quotes from the white women suffragettes about the 15th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony says, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ask for the vote for the Negro and not for the woman." The president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, Anna Howard Shaw, says, "You have put the ballot in the hands of your Black men, thus making them political superiors of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses." So with the 15th Amendment and the right to vote for Black men, what white women suffragettes do is to join the campaign pushing harder for the voting rights for white women, but pushing for the exclusion of the right to vote from Black, Native American, and Asian women. And so that's the context, right, that Black women are working in. Kind of trying to protect the right to vote for Black men, and that their white female suffragette allies have turned against the Black male vote. That's what Black women are confronting. And what Black women do is to create their own agenda in several ways. They understand that anything that works in the realm of power is in itself politics. So they don't have the right to vote, but can they work to garner greater power for the Black community? And what Black women scholars have begun to analyze is the way in which Black women see suffrage empowering the community, and they do not frame suffrage as solely an individual right. It is a right exercised not for yourself. It is an exercise for the entire community. And even the Freedmen's Bureau agents who are in the South and see Black women organizing think it's stupid and foolish, and actually don't even want the women to come to the various Republican meetings and the conventions, and the Black women come anyway. And in fact, what Black people do is to say, if Black women can't come to the Republican meetings in Georgia or in South Carolina, where can we have our meeting and we can have whoever we want to come to our meeting? Right, we can have the meeting at the Black church. And we can have anyone we want come. And in fact, Republicans do think, what are these women doing here, right? Black women are at all the meetings. Black women are speaking at all the meetings. They don't have the right to vote, but they have voice, and they are given voice. They organize political societies and clubs. They engage in political campaigns. They are wearing their Republican campaign badges. They are telling each other to make sure the men in your household vote correctly. And if they don't vote correctly, make sure there's a high price to pay if they don't. And so voting becomes a family and community event for celebration of Black empowerment, even when Black women themselves don't have the right to vote. I wanted to point out, though, Alonzo J. Rancier, who's a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina, also served as the lieutenant governor in South Carolina and a congressman. Um, he and the president of the South Carolina Women's Rights Association. He lobbies, in fact, for women's right to vote in South Carolina, saying, until women as well as men have the right to vote, the government of the United States cannot be said to rest upon the consent of the governed. These are some of the kinds of things Black women are doing to have political agency even without the right to vote. They are organizing conventions for the entire Black population. For example, this one in Richmond, where Black men, women, and children all come together. They are part of parades and rallies and mass meetings. I want us to see this high level of Black political activity and organizing around the Republican platform and Black freedom. What you see on the right is a broadside advertising a meeting in 1870 for the ratification of the 1870 Virginia Constitution, which will have to outlaw slavery in order to come back into the Union, and a meeting for the 15th Amendment and the establishment of free public schools, something I said earlier, which will be the platform for Black politicians on the state level. By recognizing that the 15th Amendment is only in place in 1870. In the 1870s, we already see the gradual unraveling of the Black political participation. What I will often say to my students is, think of Reconstruction as a window of opportunity for Black people that opens only with federal troops in the South. And then once those federal troops are withdrawn, that window closes. So Black people have Black people have political participation. So here in participation, I am including Black women who exercise the right to participate, even though they can't vote. And then that window closes for Black political participation, but we will see Black people continue to organize. I pull up this slide referencing the Amnesty Act of 1872. So we understand that this act in itself will be part of the demise of Black voting in the South for Black men. Because what this will do is to give amnesty to all the Confederates who had not been allowed to come back to Congress, had not been allowed to come back to the Senate, had not been allowed to resume political office as part of the terms of the ending of the Civil War. And amnesty in 1872 simply says all of these people can go back into power, and indeed they do. And what we will see is the decline of Black men serving in public office and people who have been Confederate leaders, military officers will go back into power. When this happens in the 1870s and following, we have what we call the Jim Crow period, lynching, ritual violence, and rape. This is the time period of the evolution of a scientific racism. I refer to this when we did the colonial lesson and talked about how Thomas Jefferson in 1787 gives his analysis of who and what Black people are and how they smell and how they look and how they sleep and how they have no intellect and have no reason, have no culture. The scientific age, of course, when we come to the end of the 19th century, has started to categorize all human beings, especially using Charles Darwin's theories of evolution and placing a kind of social construction on top of his scientific one and calling the social one also scientific. And, this is the era of phrenology of, what is the size of someone's head and what, how much space is between their eyes. It's used in immigration discrimination, especially against Southern and Eastern Europeans, to create a hierarchy of humanity with Black people at the bottom. This is a period of intimidation and harassment. And remember, both the murder of Black people, rape of Black women, intimidation, harassment is done with impunity, and that people are not held accountable legally for these actions. And then we will have the unraveling of the civil rights acts of Reconstruction and the unraveling of federal protection of Black people's rights. And instead, we will have legal discrimination and segregation as the law of the land from Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case in 1896, which legalizes segregation. And then finally, we will have the disenfranchisement of Black men voting. We'll look at some numbers as to what happens with the Black vote. And then we can't ignore the cycle of debt and impoverishment that's created by a system of sharecropping. That becomes really important when we look at Black people migrating to the North and how that shifts the economic foundation of Black households. I bring to your attention this particular Condé Thomas Nast political cartoon because it so powerfully summarizes the demise of congressional or Republican Reconstruction. And what I've done here is to list for you what is on this illustration. It's not a real monument, it's the illustration of a monument really to the demise of Reconstruction. And so what's on the front of it is a list of whippings and auction of enslaved people at the top. And then next it has a list of all the massacres, riots, and killings that I mentioned earlier. The phrase, "This is a white man's government," it quotes from, so it's doing this historical piece on the front. It quotes from the Dred Scott case in 1857, which says Black people are not citizens of the United States and can't be citizens of the United States, that the founding fathers didn't intend for Black people to be citizens, and that Black people have no rights that any white person has to respect, was said in the Justice Taney's Supreme Court decision. And then there are quotes from all over saying, we must make the Negro understand that we are, we are men and we hold them in abject bondage. Negro killed, one less vote. Burning schoolhouses and churches throughout the states, hung up or shot down in the roads and streets. From the New York world, we despise the Negro. And what I want you to especially notice at the bottom of the screen, you see a bloodied, dead Black woman holding a baby and her dead child also on the concrete next to her. And in the background of this illustration, you see white vigilantes. On the right is the Ku Klux Klan, robed. And on the left, you have, so the background on the right with the flames is the Ku Klux Klan representing the South, okay? What you see on the left with the lamppost is a caricature and depiction of an Irishman in an urban environment. I know Nass is referring to New York. And I want you to note though, if you kind of pull up this, you can just Google "patience on a monument" and pull this up and look at it even more closely. The Irishman also is a caricature. So the Irishman kind of does not look like a normal human being. The Irishman looks animal-like. And so you have the, this racism within the racism depiction here in this particular monument. This also reminds me of, I don't have the poem up for you, but it reminds me of the Langston Hughes poem, A Dream Deferred, right? Patience on a Monument, showing Black people having left slavery, but still waiting for the end of dehumanization and death of Black men, women, and children. How do Black people become disenfranchised? Black men. Almost all Black men become disenfranchised during this time period before we reach 1900. Look at this number in 6 years in Mississippi, that Black men make up 44.8% of the vote, and that dropped to 4% in 1896. The Supreme Court cases in Williams versus Mississippi legitimizes the literacy tests and the poll tax. I'll show you a little bit more on the literacy tests. I don't know if any of you have ever seen one, but it's simply egregious. And you can see how it was nothing more than a ruse to keep Black men from voting. And then states also introduced the grandfather clause, which protects the voting rights of men registered to vote in 1867 and their sons and grandsons. And so by definition, it protects the white vote while getting rid of the Black vote. We have a comment in the chat, I'm gonna check. Yes, we're going to talk about, at the very end, I've tried to allow time for talking about new ways of restricting the right to vote. So thank you. So here's a Louisiana literacy test. And I'm showing you the entire thing, but I also have the next slide pulls out some specific questions I thought you might find interesting. Like in the space below, write the word noise backwards and place over what would be a second letter. Should it be written for, let me get rid of this. Should it be written forward? All right. One of my favorites is number 21. Write the word vote upside down, but in the correct order. Number 27, write right from left to right, as you see it spelled here. And 28, divide a vertical line in two parts by dissecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot bisection of the vertical. And of course, one of the most convenient ruses was to have someone trying to register to vote feel the intimidation from their employer by them having to write down on their registration who employs them. And then finally, an example of what a white applicant may be asked to, in terms of interpreting the Constitution. They may be asked to interpret all elections by the people shall be by ballot. And then a Black person could be asked to interpret this corporate tax code that you see below. And I won't read because I actually don't understand it. And so these mechanisms could be used completely subjectively to keep Black men from voting. So Black people, once again, as they did with abolition, as they did with Reconstruction, now are dealing with a nationwide strategy that disenfranchises Black men and literally puts Black people's lives on the line with impunity. Black women organize. And so what I will do throughout the rest of the presentation is give you a few more examples of these Black women leaders. Many of them you would not have heard of, some of them perhaps, but I want to take some time to introduce you to them. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was an abolitionist, feminist suffragette, and also a poet. During her lifetime, she was much more famous and well-known even than Paul Laurence Dunbar, which most people have heard of. But she really was the shining star among Black poets of the time period. She helped to found the American Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. And this association in particular was both looking at Black women's right to vote, but also protecting Black men. She was on the national lecture circuit. She was also a writer and essayist on the power of Black women's voices. And she also became a co-founder and vice president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And what we will see here, and remember the intersectionality. One of the things we need to remember is when I give you names of these particular people, they're all operating in the same circles for suffrage, for civil rights, in creating these new national organizations. And for Black women in particular, they are also in the Black church organizing. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin is a phenomenal woman that you may not have heard of. She was born to a free family. Her parents were very well-to-do. She created the Woman's Era Club. This was a club primarily for African-American women. And it had two purposes. One was to offer its members opportunities for self-improvement and to address issues that directly affected the African-American community. And so the Women's Era Club, founded in Boston in 1894, was doing everything from local politics and education, dealing with discrimination, terrorism against Black people. She also was the founder of the very first newspaper published by and for African-American women called The Woman's Era. And very importantly, she convened the first National Conference of the Colored Women of America in 1895. So you can see how Ruffin is trying to create this national platform and national organization to deal with Black people's issues, both suffrage, both women's empowerment, and with education. And as I said before, with the intersectionality, she's also a charter member of the NAACP, which as we go along in time, all of these women will be also part of the NAACP. Again, it's not a matter of they have to choose one thing over another. I did not find a lot of information on this group of the Women's League in Rhode Island of these Black women in 1899, but they look so good. I had to include their pictures. They are simply, just beautiful and strident and powerful women that I wanted you to see this group in Newport, Rhode Island. It also tells us something about Black women's organizing throughout the North during this period of Jim Crow hardening. They are organizing everywhere. There is no state or major city where Black women aren't organizing and creating these clubs. Another close-up picture of these women. One of the most important people in this time period will be Ida B. Wells Barnett, who comes to be known at the time as the Princess of the Black Press. Ida B. Wells is from Memphis, Tennessee. She 3 of her best friends, one of whom, the child of one of them, she is the godmother. 3 of her friends are lynched, and they are lynched because they have a successful grocery store across the street from a white grocery store. That is the only reason these men are murdered, is because of the success of their business. You can think of it as being very similar to what happens in the Greenwood community, the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that Black success is not only attacked, Black success actually results in businesses destroyed and murder. And so if anyone wants to question whether or not Black people are ambitious, the response would be that Black people die for their ambition. Ida B. Wells Barnett, when her 3 friends are killed, and she is only in her 20s, and she's a school teacher, she realizes they have not been killed because they raped a Black woman. And she begins to publicly say that the whole idea of Black men, of Black men raping white women as the rationale given for lynchings is all wrong, and it's a lie. And she says it publicly, and of course is run out of town in Memphis with a price on her head. She continues to be a ardent journalist. She writes about lynching, that becomes her area of expertise. And she is the leader in the press of that campaign. And when she joins as one of the founders of the NAACP. Remember, I talked about all of these Black women's clubs all over the country organizing, even in Little Rhode Island. It's Mary Church Terrell and others will in 1896 bring all of these clubs together into a single organization. The National Association of Colored Women is the first civil rights organization in the United States, not the NAACP. This is the first civil rights organization in the United States, founded with the motto, "Lifting as we climb." And the goal of this association is the same that we've talked about before: suffrage for Black women, civil rights for Black people, getting rid of Jim Crow, segregation, and discrimination. And I am proud to say that the library at my alma mater and Terrell's alma mater, Oberlin College, is now named the Mary Church Terrell Library at Oberlin College. A picture of the founders in 1896. 1913, pictures of Black women in their own suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago. This takes us up to the 19th Amendment and women receiving the right to vote. We continue to have white women and white men as well challenge Black enfranchisement altogether. I want us to look carefully at this newspaper announcement in Virginia about Black women receiving the right to vote. So what you see here is a warning against the 19th Amendment because Black women would be included. And what this does is to say, Virginia warns her people against women's suffrage. So the issue they're talking about here, though, is not women voting, is that if women are given the right to vote, it will include Black people. And we don't want more Black people voting, is what it says. 29 counties would go under Negro rule over 60 counties in the state of Georgia, the entire state of Mississippi, because the state of Mississippi is majority Black. What of your state, your county? Isn't it about time for reflecting men and women to think and act. And then they list the threatened counties. So they're telling these white people, if you let women vote, Black people, in fact, will have political power in your county, and you don't want that. So we can't have any women voting if the result will be the empowerment of Black people. When we moved then into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, Black women not only have the right to vote, but they are working toward ending Jim Crow, which includes still lynching. Congress had refused the NAACP's efforts to have an anti-lynching bill become federal law. Senator Cory Booker in 2020 introduced to Congress the effort to have anti-lynching as federal law. So we should be accustomed now to it taking centuries to move the needle on Black equality and freedom and protection. One of the most important things that empowers the Black vote is the Great Migration. Millions, right? You see these numbers? Millions of Black people over one generation moved to northern cities. So if we look just at New York City from 1910 and 1930, right? We see this almost quadrupling of the New York City population. Same thing is true for Chicago or Philadelphia, almost 3 times. What this does when Black people, so several things are happening. Let me show you one more slide. This is the second Great Migration, 1930s, 50s. So remember when I mentioned to you earlier that we began to see a third generation of representation, Black people in Congress? It is because of this migration. And this migration combined with housing discrimination. And so the numbers go up by the millions. In this generation, this 20 years, we see the percentages go up, especially out west in California. The earlier one is primarily a route that goes from the south straight to the north and Midwest and Northeast. What these numbers will do, along with housing redlining for Black communities where Black people can buy homes, are allowed to buy homes, can get mortgages, or even can rent. It creates voting districts for Black people. They're in the North where they are free to exercise. Black men and women can vote. And this begins the process of both the shift to the Democratic Party, which occurs during the second Roosevelt administration. Remember, Black folk are in the party of Lincoln, really until the late 1930s. And it also creates a clientage relationship between kind of big city Democratic machine boss politics in the 1930s and the ability of Black people in those communities to really negotiate political power with those political bosses in the Democratic Party. So by the time we're reaching the 1940s, and this is the period that historians consider to be the early or the long civil rights movement, Black women are forming, they're continuing to be major players in the NAACP. Black women have organized the National Association of Colored Women, which is a powerful national organization. And of course, by this time from the 19-teens following, Black college women have also formed the Black sororities at historically Black colleges and universities. And then I don't want to leave out that Black women have formed their own seats of power within the Black church. What we see in the 1940s, though, is an ecumenical and interracial movement that that centers around women's political agency in civil rights and using still the church as a platform. So 1941, we have the creation of Church Women United, which becomes not only national, but an international organization that's bringing together, interestingly, of course, Protestant and Catholic women during a period when Catholics are still marginalized and discriminated against in American society. The YWCA in 1946 creates an interracial charter which says, wherever there is injustice on the basis of race within the community, the nation, or the world, our protests must be clear and our labor for its removal vigorous and steady. And so very much unlike the white suffragettes, you begin to see within this movement, and we'll see it as well with the Freedom Riders, for example, that white women will be engaged in this racial struggle with white women. One of the key features of this long civil rights movement, in other words, a movement that's really 1930s, 40s as the kind of incubation period of the civil rights movement, is the work that Rosa Parks does to protect Black women who are victims of interracial sexual violence. She organizes a committee for equal justice when Reese Taylor, along with a group of Black women, are walking home, coming back from church, and Mrs. Taylor is gang raped. And this becomes Rosa Parks' work in civil rights really is, in Montgomery, really is organized around this fight for Black women. And it's a part of her story that very often isn't told. As Danielle McGuire says in her book, At the End of a Dark Street, that Rosa Parks is doing this organizing and Martin Luther King is still in high school. What Danielle McGuire in particular argues in her book, it is the organization that Rosa Parks puts together in 1944 that becomes the Montgomery Improvement Association. And so what McGuire does that is a turning point in the way scholars understand that Montgomery movement is that Montgomery movement starts really with Rosa Parks, not her sitting on the bus, but her organizing the community. I just love Diane Nash. She's tough. That's the only way I can describe her. Diane Nash, student at Fisk. She was a compatriot with the late Honorable John Lewis, part of the, a founder of SNCC, also one of the Freedom Riders. This is a quote from her: "We presented Southern white races with a new set of options, kill us or desegregate." And she was quite serious. So as many of you may know, with the Freedom Riders, Black and white college students who are riding through the South as a part of desegregating public transportation, their buses, they are accosted. One of their buses is burned. Martin Luther King and other Black leaders say, stop, somebody's going to get killed. The federal government becomes involved. Bobby Kennedy is calling down, and at one point is saying, "Who is Diane Nash? Who is this person?" Because she essentially says, "We will not stop unless we're dead. That is the only way we will stop this movement." She is part of the voting rights movement in Alabama and specifically in Selma. Many of you know of Fannie Lou Hamer, who challenges not only the Mississippi Democratic Party, but she challenges Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Democratic Party as well. You see her on the left here at the convention presenting the credentials of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as the legitimate representatives of Mississippi. And on the right, a picture of her after she was arrested and brutally beaten for her activism as a sharecropper and a spokeswoman for Black enfranchisement. Ella Baker, known as Fundi by the college students and people like Diane Nash, she actually was one of the founders of SNCC. I know we think of Stokely Carmichael when SNCC comes to mind, but it's Ella Baker, who is a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and also a leader and worker organizer of the NAACP, who tells this younger generation, you don't have to follow these Black ministers. You should have your own organization and call the shots yourself. Baker began working with the NAACP in 1940. She was a field secretary for organizing branches throughout the South. As you can imagine, very dangerous work. She's the one who helped Martin Luther King organize SCLC. So in some ways, she is the epitome of this early organizing. Joanne Gibson Robinson. When we think of the Montgomery bus boycott, we picture Martin Luther King, probably Rosa Parks, and maybe E.D. Nixon, but we don't see Joanne Gibson Robinson. Joanne Gibson Robinson was one of the founders of the Women's Political Council in Montgomery in 1946. And the Women's Political Council really was organized to deal with this bus issue because Black people, especially Black women, domestic workers going to work, dealt with these segregated bus situations all the time. Think of it, a bus having to be desegregated. It's a tiny space. And the negotiating that space occurs every day on every bus because Black people have to ride the bus, Black women in particular. And so the Women's Political Council really is organized to deal with the harassment of Black women on Montgomery buses. And so when the decision is made by the NAACP for the boycott, it is the Women's Political Council that's already organized to print, and I don't mean on a computer in 1946, print on these old-fashioned, for maybe most of you on the call, the mimeograph machines where you actually had to put the blue ink and the sheet over it and then literally crank out copies and then you have to ink it again. They printed 10,000 leaflets and they did this over a weekend. And these leaflets on the weekend told people that they should not ride the buses that Monday. 10,000 leaflets printed and then distributed to create a successful year-long movement in 1955 for Montgomery. It is the efforts of all of these women and their intersectional agency that brings about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that will once again, just like under congressional Reconstruction, try to guarantee Black people, men and women, full citizenship and the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act has meaning. If you look at these numbers from Southern states and the difference between the percentage of Black people voting in 1960 and 1971, I want to draw your attention in Mississippi at the bottom, from 5% to 59%, or Alabama from 14% to 55%. So here we see the egregious suppression of the Black vote significantly lifted by the Voting Rights Act. And we know from the history that this change would not have occurred without federal government intervention. And it is this kind of intervention where we get our first woman elected to the Congress of the United States and the first Black woman candidate for the Democratic Party slate. As we move to the end now, I want us to revisit the concepts we started with in terms of the intersectionality with a couple of pieces, starting with the Combahee River Collective statement. The Combahee River Collective, organized in 1974 by Black feminists and lesbians, primarily to once again address the exclusion of Black women from the white women's feminist movement and the way in which Black women had been marginalized within the Black Power movement as well. I want us to pay close attention to these 4 excerpts I've pulled from what is called the Combahee River Collective Statement. First, which tells us, I think, something about both the purpose and the goals. First, before looking at the recent development of Black feminism, we would like to affirm that we find our origins in the historical reality of Afro-American women's continuous life and death struggle for survival and liberation. And the Black scholars that are part of this movement, in particular, this will be the time period when they resurrect the history of many of the women I've talked about. With scholarship written on women like Mariah Stewart, scholarship written on women like Mary Church Terrell and the Club Women's movement. Next, Black feminist politics also have an obvious connection to movements for Black liberation, particularly those in the 1960s and 1970s. And here, the Black women in the collective are saying, we will not buy into a white feminist notion of prioritizing one part of ourselves over another. Next, Black feminists and many more Black women who do not define themselves as feminists have all experienced sexual oppression as a constant factor in our day-to-day existence. So here, the collective very strategically says, you actually don't even, for Black women, you don't even have to call yourself a feminist or even think of yourself as a feminist. And you may not even like the idea of being a feminist. But one thing we do know is that you have suffered sexual oppression, and that we do have in common. And then the final excerpt I pulled for you, above all else, our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, maybe because of our need as human persons for autonomy. And so there's this statement that says we don't have to, Black women don't have to shape their agency around white women or around Black men, that we actually can shape our agenda solely in terms of our intersectional selves. In many ways, this moment in 1991 with the Supreme Court hearings for the nomination of now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court became a moment for Black women to demonstrate what that agency meant in defending themselves. What you see here is a picture of a New York Times full page, African-American women in defense of themselves, where 1,600 Black women nationwide raised $10,000 over only a few months in order to put a full page ad in the New York Times and other papers nationwide. And the purpose of this piece was to defend not just Anita Hill in particular, but yes, her, but also the way in which she was attacked was clearly seen as an attack against Black womanhood. And it was an attack that these Black scholars and activists, me included, saw as an attack against all of us. If we think back to that Combahee statement, or think all the way back to the 19th century and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's statement about the need for Black women to have their own platform, the New York Times becomes the platform for these 1,600 women to say that we don't have to take a kind of attack against Black womanhood without defending ourselves. These are excerpts on the left directly from this ad from the New York Times and other papers. We're particularly outraged by the racist and sexist treatment of Professor Anita Hill, an African-American woman who was maligned and castigated for daring to speak publicly of her own experience of sexual abuse. We pledge ourselves to continue to speak out in defense of one another, in defense of the African-American community, and against those who are hostile to social justice, no matter what color they are. No one will speak for us but ourselves. And again, it is, I hope, easy to see the connection between these statements, Mariah Stewart, Ellen Frances Watkins Harper, Ruffin and Terrell, Combahee River Collective, and then in 1991, these women. And we end with looking at our own times and voter suppression and the Black community's response to that. Which is very difficult. However, in the state of Georgia, we have this 2015 redistricting that I have a picture of here. And we should note that there was an effort made to again redistrict in 2017 that was defeated in the state of Georgia. We have several forms that voter suppression has taken, someone mentioned earlier. In Shelby County versus Holder, the Voting Rights Act itself is weakened by the Supreme Court decision. Redistricting, as you see in this example from Georgia in 2015, strict ID requirements such as a proof of citizenship, which many Americans don't have unless you travel and need a passport. Or if, as we know, for many elderly Black Americans, they can't find or locate a birth certificate from, decades ago. The purging of voter rolls, very often done randomly so that people don't know that they have been purged until they show up to vote. Someone mentioned in the chat the fact that although Florida gave former felons the right to vote, Florida also initially tied the right to vote to repaying of fines and restitution, which for many former felons was in the thousands and thousands of dollars, and it would have been impossible for them to vote. But as we know, in most places throughout the United States, former felons are, when they are released and serve their time, still do not have the right to vote, even though they have paid the legal penalty for crimes if they were indeed committed. We have the reducing of polling locations, changing locations, and consistent information about polling hours, which makes it very difficult for people to even get to the polls and to vote. And it is also part of creating the excessive long lines to discourage people from voting. I read in one piece written on a Black women's platform that advised kind of don't let anyone tell you in a long line, when you're in a long line, that you can just come back later. The advice was just stay in line and make sure you get a chance to vote. And I end here with one of my most powerful quotes, I think, from Nanny Helen Burroughs, part of that women's club movement in the early 19th century. And Burroughs, to quote her, said for Black women, We specialize in the wholly impossible. Thank you very much. We have time for questions and some discussion. This may have taken longer than I had planned, but I wanted to connect the dots, and as you can see, there are a lot of them. But I would love to take a few questions. Let's see, is there something in the chat? Joanne Robinson, is she known to be the first to refuse her seat? No. So Joanne Robinson's role is not so much the not sitting on the bus, which Rosa Parks does. And there are lots of Black women who do that earlier, before Rosa Parks does. What Joanne Robinson has done is to create the organization to get to have an effective boycott. Somebody has to organize Black people in the city of Montgomery to know not to get on the buses that Monday. And it is this organization, the Women's Political Council, that already exists, that has already been trying to work on this issue of the buses. They're the ones that actually do the distribution and organize the community, as we've seen Black women had been doing for centuries. Someone has posted the poems of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Yes. And it's really interesting. When I was first introduced to her, I knew of Paul Laurence Dunbar, whose poems, especially in Black dialect, were beloved into the 20th century, but it is Harper's poetry that actually sold at the time. Patience on a Monument, is it still standing, and where today? Oh, that was Jennifer's questions. This is just an illustration of the ravages of Reconstruction. So it is not an actual statue, but rather it is a Thomas Nast illustration of what was happening. Oh, someone said, thank you for pointing out the background and foreground. Yeah, you would need to pull it up and look at it more closely, the Patience on a Monument. A reminder that you can unmute yourselves if you want to speak now. I'm sorry, I forgot to remind you of that. You don't have to remain in silence, just hearing more of my voice.
I have a simple question. Now, in the 1860s, when the slaves were freed and ran for office, they couldn't read, most of them, could they? So how were they able to function in a political atmosphere?
That's an excellent question. So many of the men who go into public office were in fact literate. And if you recall, at this point in the 1860s, most whites in America, in the South in particular, are illiterate because the South does not have a strong public school system at all. That system really is put into place by Black people during Reconstruction. The Black men who go into office are, I can't think of one in particular at this high level in particular that are not literate. Many of them are Black ministers. Some of them, in fact, have come from the North and moved south and are then representing the South. Some of them were free Blacks in the South already, like PBS Pinchback in Mississippi is fairly wealthy, also a landowner. But a lot of them are both ministers. They are skilled tradesmen. They would have come from being, carpenters and blacksmiths, that kind of work. So I can't think of any of them, especially the congressmen and senators, who were illiterate.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, it was a perfect question. Yeah. But you're right, obviously, they would have been the exception, the fact that they were literate. Oh, and I forgot to add a really important one, that many of them also served in the Union Army in the Civil War also. Yeah. Any other questions? Don't forget to unmute. Okay, well, thank you all so very much. You probably have just a little bit of election fatigue, just like I do. So it truly warms my heart that you are here. And I will leave you with the Nanny Ellen Burroughs and believing in the wholly impossible.
Well, just before you do that, I just wanted to say all of your lectures have such a wealth of information. I really do hope we get another opportunity, maybe post-COVID, to have you speak again and just enjoy you, because it was so much and so good that all of it cannot quite remain within. I need another dose, as they say, to make sure that it stays.
Well, thank you, Dee. I will say that Montclair Public Library Adult School has listened to you all. I already have an email saying, will I do something in the winter? And I will let you know that I'll be in the first in line for my shot, so I can have a party and reunion with all of you in person.
Thank you.
Yeah, could I also make a recommendation for something that I think would be interesting? To maybe have a lecture on those unknown women of the civil rights movement that were behind all the well-known men. You mentioned a few of them, but I'm sure there was a lot more.
Oh, there are.
And I've never heard a lecture or a talk that really incorporated the lives of and the activities of some of these women. We've heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, of course, but not a lot of the others.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I would love to do that. And you know, one of the things you hear in just those pieces I gave you from, especially the Combahee Collective, is a recognition that there is, in fact, this long, deep, rich history of Black women's activism in civil rights and in the feminist movement. And a feeling that, in fact, white women kind of co-opted the notion that, you know, kind of this movement was their movement, and defined kind of outside of the movement all women of color and working class women in general, because the platform really didn't apply to them or respond to their issues, and definitely excluded race as an issue. And Black women could, and therefore it didn't include, if you don't include race, you haven't included Black women. And so there is a much longer history scholars have now talked about of this intersectional activism that is generations old, that has in fact created people like a Shirley Chisholm, right, or a Kamala Harris.
Thanks.
Are you local?
Montclair?
Yes.
Yep, 27 years.
Okay.
I'm not in Montclair right now. I'm a lot farther south, where it's really warm.
That's nice.
It is. It is. I'm trying to be retired.
We won't let you.
I'm not doing it very well.
We won't let you.
I see. Although, yeah, but well, my husband says, let me get this straight. You're not working for Drew anymore, and you are working, but you're not getting paid. So, but I really enjoy this public history work. It is something I've always enjoyed doing. And so to have all of you as my class is a real joy and indeed an honor. I look forward to more of these. I've written down women of the civil rights movement, and I will put this down definitely as a possibility for winter series. And I will, in fact, I am a little late in getting the bibliography done for you. I've been distracted, let's say. But I will get that bibliography of readings for you from the 2 lectures on the colonial period and also for this one.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards. As I said in the chat, that it's a great way to end this discussion with a picture of none other than Kamala Harris.
Right.
Yay.
Well, I'm sure in her life she had to believe in the holy impossible, as is true for most Black women, that we wake up every day believing in the holy impossible.
Dr. Edwards,
Yes.
could you make any comments? I've been reading with the elections and things, of course, of the work that Stacey Abrams has done to really bring out the vote there. And I've just been admiring her work. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think I just heard something from a friend of mine who just retired from Spelman and for whom Stacey Abrams was one of her students at Spelman College in Atlanta. Yes, I mean, what I think she is doing is part of this tradition of organizing, in some ways not herself, but actually working through the established organizing in the Black community. Mm-hmm. And working through the central organizations that already have these networks established. One would be the Black Church. There has been nationwide organizing among all of the Black sororities and fraternities called the Divine Nine, especially the one Kamala is a member of. Kamala is a member of the AKAs. All 9 have come together as kind of a coalition, which is also nationwide, but that is something that Stacey Abrams has been to pull on as well. And then also the demographics, as many of you may know, the demographics of Georgia, especially the Atlanta area, but also Savannah, and even in my hometown of Columbus, Georgia, those demographics have shifted significantly in terms of Georgia being, especially the area around Atlanta, being a corporate center for the entire Southeast and the nation, a place where you have this growing number of Fortune 500 companies and Fortune 1000 in particular. And so this whole notion of Georgia of being this Southern base is unraveling in Georgia in particular because of Atlanta becoming so cosmopolitan. I'm not surprised to see the same thing happen in a place like Savannah, where when I was there visiting my daughter at SCAD, I kept thinking, I don't even hear Southern accents. And this was a few years ago, and I commented to my husband, and I said, there are people who are from Savannah who will say they're from Savannah and have no Southern accent whatsoever. And I said to him, their parents aren't from Savannah. And so I think the shifting demographics plus the in some ways old-fashioned grassroots organizing of the Black community, and you put the technology on top of that existing base of organizing, and having someone dynamic enough to use that, which is, you do need the committed and charismatic, smart leader. And Stacey Abrams brings all of that to the table.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. If I do this again, I'll put her in the slide.
Thank you.
Since I'm from Georgia, I really should. Well, thank you all very much. Have a good weekend. Be well, be at peace, get some sleep.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Edwards, thank you for wonderful
Wash
work.
your hands, wear your mask, keep your distance.
Bye-bye, and thanks
Bye-bye.
again.
Thank you, Maurice.
Lecture. Thank you.